All right, so today's topic is from resentment to reverence, navigating emotional triggers. This isn't going to be a super long training. I have done trainings in the past on resentment and some of the more unflattering, maybe, emotions that you might experience through caregiving. But I wanted to revisit resentment again and maybe give it a different tone. This training is really going to be more about validation than education, because I think that when we can validate how we feel, we're more likely to offer ourselves compassion for those emotions. And naming emotions and knowing the triggers, that's how we navigate life, right? That's how we can reduce our stress, and that's how we can broaden our capacity for compassion for ourselves and the loved one that we're taking care of. So throughout this presentation, if you have any questions or comments, I just ask that you either put them in the chat or hold on to them till the end. These trainings are recorded and they're posted online, and so I want to make sure that if conversation does happen, it's not something that is just blasted on the internet, that we can have that after I turn the recording off, and we can be more open and vulnerable in that space. Okay, so let me get my notes up so that I know what I'm talking about, or at least I can pretend to know what I'm talking about. All right, and we'll get started here. So why does it matter? Why does it matter to know about our emotions and our triggers to them and taking introspection? Well, I think it matters because then you know you're not alone, right? You are less likely to beat yourself up if you realize this is common, this is expected, and it's something you can navigate, right? So if you've ever felt resentment while you're caregiving, please know that there's nothing wrong with you. Okay, you're not broken, you're not ungrateful, you're not a villain. You're a human being, right? And resentment, hopefully through this presentation, you'll learn resentment doesn't just show up, right? It comes after time and time again denying yourself the meeting of your own needs. And so it doesn't have to be something that completely takes over, and it doesn't have to be something that roots in you and stays there either. But again, you have to acknowledge that that's what you're feeling and not be afraid of saying that that's what you're feeling. Okay. Caregiving is sacred work, but it doesn't mean that that's easy, right? And sometimes the emotions that we get that brings up are very messy and they're confusing, and sometimes they're even taboo, right? So we're going to talk about those emotions, again, not to judge them, but just to better understand them and to honor what they're trying to say, right? Because emotions all serve a purpose, even the ones that are uncomfortable. I even argue, especially the ones that are uncomfortable, right? It's like an alarm system that goes off, right? So we don't want to judge them. We just want to try to understand them. We want to honor them and what they're trying to say. Resentment, it doesn't mean that you're failing. It's just a signal, right, that something needs to be addressed. Okay. And once we address that, once we honor that, it can melt into reverence. Okay. So I have a reflection prompt for you. Of course, you don't have to say this out loud. It's just something I want you to kind of hold inside for a little bit and think about. What emotion have you been afraid to admit that you feel in your caregiving role? Just think about that. What emotion have you been afraid to admit that you feel in your caregiving role? I'm guessing there's probably more than one, but maybe some of you have never even asked yourself that question, right? Sometimes our emotions get a little bit elevated and then we immediately feel uncomfortable and we shove them down again, right? So maybe you've never even given yourself the opportunity to let that question be answered, right? So let's talk about what resentment is, okay? So resentment's one of those emotions that we're taught to avoid or hide. But again, in caregiving, it shows up kind of often. Not because you don't care, obviously, but because you care so much. And often you get very little rest, very little help, and very little reciprocity. And not even necessarily from people outside of your caregiving role, but the person you're caring for, right? depending on the diagnosis, there could be a massive shift in your relationship with that person. And where it used to be a give and take, a 50-50, now it's a little bit unbalanced because of their diagnosis, right? And it's not anybody's fault, it's just the way it is. But again, even though you understand it, and even though you accept it, and even though you have compassion for it, that doesn't mean that you are immune to feeling resentment over the situation you're in, okay? So resentment isn't cruelty, and it's not a weakness. It's just a message. And usually that message is, I'm doing too much, right? I'm not being supported. I'm not feeling seen, right? Um, and that can be hard, right? And that's something that you can wait in for a long, long time before you ever address it, right? Um, so in the world of psychology, we think of resentment as what they call a secondary emotion. And so what that means is that it shows up on top of something deeper. So maybe that's grief. Maybe that's just exhaustion. Maybe it's a sense of powerlessness, right? So it's kind of like the crust over the soup, right? The cover that's kind of hiding what's underneath. Um, and it's an ache inside of you, or a pain inside of you, an unmet need that hasn't really been able to surface and to be heard, right? And resentment's also a boundary alarm. So we talk a lot about boundaries in the caregiving world. And oftentimes we think of boundaries as just shutting people out and saying no, right? But a boundary is a protective thing, yes, but it's also a way to invite people in, right? Show people how they can approach you, how they can be in your space without depleting you, right? So when we give more than we want to give, or when our yes should have been a no, that resentment can kind of start going off. That alarm can go off saying, I've crossed the boundary, or somebody's crossed my boundary, or I've allowed a boundary to be crossed by myself, right? When we say no, or when we say yes, we really want to say no, right? And if we ignore that alarm, it doesn't just stop, right? It just kind of gets deeper in us, right? It just kind of settles in, and then it's just like constantly in the background going off, right? And that can show up as bitterness, irritability, or even physically, right? You can start to feel physically fatigued, headaches, backaches. Maybe you're clenching your jaw all the time, right? Maybe you cannot sit still and rest, right? And so today we're going to try to stop shaming that emotion and start learning from it. Again, this is a boundary alarm. It's not something we want to hide or ignore or brush off. We want to examine it. We want to be curious, right? So what are some characteristics, I guess? I'm gonna go ahead and read this slide. Resentment is often triggered by unmet needs or overgiving. And again, sometimes that's unavoidable, right? But we can also acknowledge those warning signs, see that being triggered, and then do what we need to do to reset, right? Go out for coffee with a friend. Tell somebody no when they ask for your help, right? That kind of thing. Resentment can mask deeper feelings like grief, guilt, fatigue. It's a sign of an emotional imbalance, not a failure, okay? Where you're just giving 80% and you 80% over here and 20% over here, and you want to kind of be more in that 50% range, okay? And of course, ignoring it is just going to lead you straight into burnout, right? So there is a lot of research in emotions and resentment and things like that. And emotion-focused therapy literature describes resentment, again, as a secondary emotion, one that sits on top of your primary feelings like sadness, grief, or shame. And when they study caregivers, they link suppressed resentment to increased stress, sleep disturbances, and relational strain, right? So unvoiced resentment is a strong predictor of caregiving burnout, according to the National Alliance for Caregiving in 2020. And I want to give you a quote here from Brene Brown. She is a doctor of psychology. And she says, resentment is not about anger. It's about unmet expectations, often expectations that were never clearly communicated to begin with. Okay. And that's easy for that to kind of sneak up on you in a caregiving role as your needs change, as your loved one's needs change. So maybe you didn't feel resentment in the beginning because you could handle it and you didn't need all this extra help and you're getting the sleep you needed and you're getting the time away that you needed. But as the diagnosis progresses and as the needs increase, then you're more flooded with all that duty and all those tasks that have to be done. And again, grief maybe. And so resentment can kind of sneak up on you because you're like, well, I was fine until I wasn't, right? So that's why it's important to see our emotions as alarm bells, right? They're trying to trigger you to look and see, what do you need? What are you missing? Okay, so we don't want to ignore them. We want to address them with curiosity and compassion. So some common triggers. Of course, I probably don't need to tell you all, but I'm going to anyway. So resentment doesn't come out of nowhere. It's a slow build, right? Kind of like that drip, drip, drip of unmet needs and silence and sacrifice, right? It just builds up over time. So some of the most common triggers that you'll hear from caregivers are things like, I feel invisible, or I miss who I used to be, right? Because you change just as much as your loved one's diagnosis can change, right? I'm the one who remembers everything and have to make all the decisions, right? You have had to become the brain for everybody under your roof, right? And that's exhausting, right? Um, Not having enough rest, or grieving someone who's still alive, right? Grieving who they used to be, grieving who you thought you were going to, you know, live out your final days with. And now that's a different story that you'd have to tell yourself, right? And sometimes you can feel resentment towards the person, and sometimes it's not even towards the person you're caring for, right? Maybe it's towards extended family, siblings who are not helping. Maybe it's resentment towards a system that is failing you, failing, a lot of people. And maybe it's just that exhaustion of never being able to put it down, right? Um, and then maybe even resentment that you feel guilty because you want to put it down, right? So it can be very, very complex, very multifaceted. And so that's why it can be kind of tricky to nail it down, because it can be wave after wave of all these feelings and you're not really sure what to do with it, right? But triggers don't mean that you're doing something wrong, right? When that alarm bell goes off, it doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It just means that you're a human being, and what you're navigating is really, really complex, right? And so the first step to healing that resentment is recognizing the patterns that create it, right? Not to blame, obviously, but just to understand. So here's some things that might set the alarm off. Again, feeling unappreciated or invisible, right? And that's kind of par for the course. Sometimes you just can't avoid that. The loss of your autonomy, your identity, or your privacy, right? Especially if you have loved ones who maybe had to move in with you. And so you've had to make space for someone in there, right? You've lost a lot of privacy, and you don't have a place to go where you're not a caregiver anymore, right? Every room in your house, you're a caregiver. Having the mental load of always having to make those decisions, especially if they're hard decisions and you're not really sure if you're comfortable with the potential outcomes, but you have to decide anyway, right? Watching a loved one decline, guilt for feeling quote unquote negative emotions, right? I feel guilty that I feel resentful. I feel guilty that I feel like I need a break, right? I feel guilty that I don't want to do this anymore, right? And then, of course, lack of emotional support or lack of rest. Okay. So, again, these are not signs that you're weak, it's signs that you are a human being. Okay. And you cannot escape that reality, unfortunately. So, I want to tell you a little bit about something called the mental load theory. And this is from emotional labor research. Okay. So mental load theory shows that when one person bears the invisible weight of tracking, anticipating, organizing needs, that emotional exhaustion escalates, right? Even if you're not physically doing a lot of work, mentally you're running on full throttle, right? And that makes you physically exhausted. Sometimes we shame ourselves because we think, I didn't even do anything all day and I'm exhausted. Well, maybe your body wasn't moving, but your brain never stopped, right? So much of our energy that we eat, like all the food that we fuel our bodies, goes towards our thought process. Okay. So you don't have to be running a marathon to feel like you did at the end of the day. If you're out here organizing and meeting needs and planning and having that foresight of anticipating needs, right? That takes a lot of energy. Another term I want to talk to you about quickly is called ambiguous loss. So this was a term that was coined by Dr. Pauline Boss, and it describes the experience of grieving someone who is still physically present, but maybe psychologically altered. Okay. And this is common in dementia caregiving or a loved one who has a terminal illness, right? And this ambiguous loss that can often feed into that guilt loop that you're in, right? That unspoken sorrow, right? They're still here, but they're not. And that can be really hard. And in 2020, the AARP Caregiving did a report in the US and said 61% of caregivers reported feeling that they had no choice in taking on the role. And that can create deep internal conflict, even when love is present, right? So you want to do it, but you don't want to do it, right? That ambivalence, that can be very complex. That can lead to resentment if we don't identify it and address it, right? So I hope you're seeing that this isn't singular to you. If you're feeling these feelings, this is very, very common. Okay, they've done studies. You're not alone. But why don't we talk about it? If we're all feeling it, why don't we talk about it, right? Maybe you've heard it or felt it. You know, people say, don't complain. Other people might have it worse. You should be grateful you still have them, right? At least they're still alive. Or maybe someone says, this is your job, you signed up for it, or maybe you're telling yourself that, right? And so we don't talk about it because those are ugly feelings, and we don't want to talk about ugly feelings, right? We don't want to talk about ones that make us feel like we're bad partners or bad parents or bad children, right? But the silence doesn't really protect us. It just makes us more isolated, right? Because we feel like I'm the only one who feels this way. I'm ashamed that I feel this way. I feel guilty that I feel this way. I'm not going to expose myself, right? So we think it's safe. Why does silence feel safer? We don't want to be seen as ungrateful. We have internalized guilt, maybe saying if I loved better, I wouldn't feel this way, right? Those are lies we tell ourselves. Maybe there is family pressure or cultural pressure that says that you have to be the strong one, right? Maybe you worry that expressing these quote unquote ugly feelings or emotions is a betrayal to your loved one and the relationship you have and your vow to take care of them. And maybe you've been experiencing some spiritual messaging from your culture that glorifies suffering, right? That we should count it all as joy. And so we don't talk about it because we're ashamed that we feel it, that we're not feeling joyful, right? But again, that silence only feeds in the shame, and shame is rot, right? We don't want that in our space if we can avoid it. And there's often a myth that caregivers carry that says if you love someone, you shouldn't feel angry, you shouldn't feel grief, you shouldn't feel tired, right? But we know that's not true. That's not love. That's what we call martyrdom, right? And martyrdom does not lead to healing. It'll just lead you straight into collapse, okay? You don't have to be everything all the time to everyone. You can't be, right? So we don't want to martyr ourselves and call it love. Sometimes we don't speak about it because we're afraid of what we'll find, right? If I start talking about it, maybe the ugly truth will surface and I have to face that, right? Or maybe no one's going to hear me when I say it out loud. But when we name our emotions, we're not betraying the people that we care for, right? It actually protects them from a version of us that's running on fumes. And we've all been there, right? We all know how bad it can probably get, right? And we want to avoid that. So naming our emotions, honoring them, staying curious about them, addressing them with compassion, that's going to protect you and your loved one from that burnout, okay? And it'll protect you from disappearing in the process, right? Acknowledging that you're human. You're not just what you do, you're who you are, right? So again, we feel that we're not allowed to feel resentment if someone else has it worse, is an echo we hear a lot. And in caregiving psychology, suppression of emotion is linked to increased chronic stress. Who needs more of that, right? It can weaken your immune function, right? You get more sick frequently. And it can just cause a lot of emotional strain, a lot of relationship strain, right? So emotional honesty is better for us. And they've done studies and it actually correlates with more effective care outcomes, right? You're a better caregiver when you're emotionally honest, even if it's the uncomfortable emotions, right? And And we can also fall victim to something called spiritual bypassing in this space, right? Where we use spiritual language to avoid or suppress difficult emotions. This has been a documented barrier in healing and caregiving grief, because we say, well, everything happens for a reason, right? That's a big one. Yeah, maybe you can believe that, but that doesn't negate the reality that you are experiencing something very painful, right? All right, so emotions as messengers. What are my feelings trying to tell me? This is where we shift from silence to understanding, right? Because what if emotions aren't problems to fix, but they're just messages to listen to? So resentment might be telling you, you said yes when you meant no, right? Anger might be saying, I need space, I need help, I need to be seen. Guilt might be trying to sort out, am I doing what's right? Am I doing what's expected? Am I doing what's best, right? And shame will tell you, you shouldn't feel this way, right? You don't have a right to feel angry. You don't have a right to feel resentful. You don't have a right to feel tired, right? That's that shame. And grief can be really hard, but it is probably one of the more honest emotions if we just really sit with it. Because grief will tell you something is ending and I haven't been able to fully say goodbye. I haven't been able to mourn. I'm carrying all of this with me and I don't know what to do with it, right? So again, none of these emotions make you a bad caregiver. They just make you a human caregiver, right? They make you a truthful one, a full one. And so the job isn't to avoid the feelings, it's to listen, to translate, and respond with care. Just like you do with your loved one, right? You're always tending their needs, emotional, physical, what have you. This is just an invitation to turn that a little bit on in yourself too, and tend to your needs, listen to your needs, respond to yourself with care, okay? So emotion-focused therapy teaches that emotions have adaptive functions. So that means they arise for a reason, right? Even when it's uncomfortable. And so when we suppress them, that's just going to lead us into more emotional dysregulation, right? How many times have you found yourself in a situation where you experience something small, right? Some small inconvenience, one word that the tone maybe hit you wrong, and you blew up, right? Why is that? Because it's not just that one thing that you got upset over. It's all this weight behind the dam that one little crack was all it took for it to flood out, right? And then we're dysregulated. Our emotions are dysregulated. Our response, our emotional response doesn't match the emotional trigger because it's not just about that one trigger. It's about all the walled up emotions that you've been holding back, right? And I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about. Let's see, mindfulness-based caregiver studies say that those who acknowledged and labeled their emotions reported significantly lower stress and improved interpersonal functioning. So how you function with other people, right? And that was a study done back in 2017. And neuroscience shows that naming a feeling, which is called affect labeling, reduces its intensity and activates that prefrontal cortex in your brain. And that helps us to respond rather than react. Okay. So if we say, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, and we're not fine, eventually we're going to have the truth come out, right? But if we say, I'm not okay, I'm stressed, I'm scared, I'm uncertain, right? Labeling that, it's like once you name it, it almost diffuses it in a little way, in a way, right? It's kind of like getting the ingredients list of everything that you're doing for the recipe and saying, okay, this is what this is what that is, and I've got this, I've got that, I need to get this, right? So you can kind of take an inventory of how you're feeling, and then you can address it appropriately, okay? So here we go, resentment inventory. So this is a self-audit, and I'm going to invite you as a fellow human being to take this short inventory, okay? So again, resentment doesn't just appear, it builds quietly, unconsciously, until one day we snap at someone we love, or cry in the car, or even just shut down and feel numb, right? You guys ever been in that space where you're just so overwhelmed, your body's just kind of like, we're not going to feel this anymore, right? Then you just kind of, boop, disconnect, right? Which gives you relief, but it's not going to be helpful in the long run, right? So this is not going to be a confession. It's not going to be judgment. It's just honesty to yourself. Okay. So just reflect silently. We don't have to pour our hearts out to each other on the internet. But I just want to read these to you and I want you to think about them. Okay. So ask yourself, what am I tired of? Where have I been performing strength instead of asking for help? What do I wish I could say out loud without consequence? That one can be kind of scary, right? What am I grieving that nobody else sees? And where do I feel like I have disappeared? Right? And the last one, what part of me is still waiting for permission to feel? Right? Because sometimes we feel like we don't have the right to feel how we feel. But you do. You absolutely do. So again, this inventory isn't about being selfish, right? It's about being sacred, right? Anything unspoken can kind of become a ghost in you, right? And you can kind of feel like you're haunted almost by it, right? So we can use things like reflective writing and emotional self audits like this um, to lower our stress and increase our resilience. Okay, they've done studies on this. Even if you write something down and you never read it again, right? Sometimes people write stuff down and they go back and they reflect and they feel all good about it. I write it down to get it out, right? I don't need to revisit. And it can be helpful, right? It's a tool for introspection. And when you have a busy mind, a busy caregiver mind, a busy caregiver schedule, sometimes you have to pencil in introspection, right? You have to pencil in these moments to sit with yourself and really navigate how you're feeling. And when we name these difficult emotions, it actually does have a positive impact on our brain. There is a part of our brain called the amygdala, and this is where a lot of our aggression and our survival instincts live. And when we are stressed and we're tired and we're frustrated, that amygdala is activated and it makes us be flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, and we get into defense mode, right? But when we name those difficult emotions, like I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm sad, that reduces that amygdala activation, right? And so we can literally calm the brain's the brain's threat response through self-examination and labeling our emotions. So if you feel like you're getting keyed up, take a minute, take a breath. What am I feeling? Give it a name. What is it trying to tell me? Okay. That's how we sit with our emotions, and that's how we learn to become emotionally resilient, not by avoiding, but by being curious and facing them head on. So boundaries without guilt. So this is hard, right? If we're honest with ourselves, setting boundaries can be very, very difficult, especially in caregiving, right? Especially if you were raised to equate love with sacrifice, right? If you love me, you do this for me, kind of a thing. And it is kind of tricky navigating boundaries in caregiving because, especially if you're taking care of someone whose capacity to care for themselves is declining, um, you know, where are the boundaries? After a while, there aren't any, right? But boundaries aren't walls. Okay, think of boundaries more of like doors, and they show other people where to meet you without breaking in, right? So they're not rejection, it's more like orientation, right? Yes, I will let you in, but this is the door. Okay. We're not asking people to bust through the wall like the Kool-Aid man. We're telling, hey, here's the door. Okay, come through this one, right? And sometimes we don't set boundaries because we think it's selfish or we don't want to seem like we're being selfish to other people. And oftentimes people who get into caregiving situations have probably had problems or at least very vague boundaries their whole lives. And, Part of that is because you maybe just naturally have a very compassionate, empathetic demeanor about you. And so you want to help, you want to give, right? You want to pour into another person. And that's not wrong. But again, boundaries help us kind of stay in that shape so that we don't lose ourselves completely, right? It doesn't leak out everywhere, okay? So when you overgive past your limit, you don't just feel exhausted. That's when you start to feel resentful, right? And that resentment can look like tension in the body, tension in your tone of voice, maybe even withdrawing from other people, right? Because I just can't do it anymore. I'm exhausted, right? But we're allowed to say, I can't talk about that right now. We're allowed to say, I need a break before I can be present here. We can say, I love you and I need help with this, right? We're not talking about shutting people out. Again, we're just saying, I need some space to get myself together, and then we can move forward, okay? And when you start a boundary practice, or when you try to strengthen your boundary practice, you will feel guilty for it, okay? That's just gonna happen. But guilt isn't like a moral compass, right? I feel guilty, now I'm a bad person, right? It's just a sign that the patterns, the old patterns are breaking, right? And that's a good thing, right? They're growing pains. And maybe that pattern you're breaking is one that told you that love means giving until there's nothing left, right? So that can be uncomfortable. So boundaries aren't about pushing people away from you. It's about staying in connection with yourself without abandonment, okay? So according to boundary researcher Nedra Glover Tawwab, I think is how you pronounce her name, healthy boundaries improve emotional clarity, increase your empathy, and prevent relational burnout. Okay, so sometimes people don't have boundaries because they are incredibly empathetic. But this research from 2021 says that if you have healthy boundaries, that can improve your empathy. It can improve your clarity around your emotions, right? So there's a study from 2002 that says compassion fatigue, which is where you just get tired of caring. Compassion fatigue shows that studies in compassion fatigue show that boundary setting is directly tied to lower cortisol levels, which is the stress hormone, improving our sleep, and increases your caregiving sustainability. Okay, so the longer you do this, the more you're going to have to set boundaries to prevent that compassion fatigue. Okay. And again, I'm going to bring it home with my girl, Brene Brown. She says, the most compassionate people are also the most boundaried. Now, I'm not talking about rigid boundaries, right? Where it's just no, 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 shutting doors into people's faces and isolating. It's where you know where your boundaries are. They're healthy boundaries. And it's not a boundary set in panic, right? Where it's like, I've reached my limit, everybody clear out, right? That's a rigid boundary. We're talking about healthy boundaries, where what comes in and out of those boundaries is up to you and you feel good about it, right? All right, next slide. Alchemizing the emotion, okay? So turning resentment into revelation or even reverence, right? So we've named resentment, we've mapped its roots, and now we ask the question, what do we do with it, right? So this is where the alchemy begins, not fixing it, but just listening to ourselves a little differently, okay? So here's an invitation. This is a process I want to invite you to, and you can use it anytime you're feeling overwhelmed by emotion, okay? Whether that's anger, resentment, bitterness, what have you. If you're overwhelmed by emotion, number one, notice it, okay? Pause and name the emotion without feeling judgment. I'm feeling resentment. I'm feeling guilt. I'm feeling angry, right? We can say that. And then you can just ask it, why are you here? What are you trying to tell me, right? Oftentimes, there's an unmet need underneath that, right? So what is that emotion asking you for? Is it rest? Is it recognition? Is it a space to grieve, maybe? And then you choose an aligned action. Okay, so I'm not saying react, we're responding. Okay, so maybe you need to set up a boundary. Maybe you need to place one with somebody in your relationships. Maybe you just need a nap, right? Maybe you need to have an honest heart-to-heart with somebody. Maybe you need a good cry. right? A lot of good things happen to us neurochemically when we cry. Okay, so holding that in is never going to do you any good. So again, we don't want to stop feeling. We just want to start listening to those feelings, because emotion, when we meet it with care, becomes movement, right? Emotions are energy in motion, right? It clears a space, it transforms, okay? So this is how we move from resentment to reverence, not by denying that we're hurting, right? But allowing it to guide us towards what is true, okay? So again, identify the message beneath the feeling. Why am I feeling this way? What is my body trying to tell me? Allow space for it without judging. Ask, what is this emotion wanting me to do or change? Okay. Respond with that aligned action: rest, boundary, grief. Okay. Again, we're just tending these emotions honestly. Okay. An emotion is not the end, it is an invitation to what's next. Okay. So this process reflects a principle from emotion-focused therapy and also mindfulness-based self-compassion, which I encourage all of you to look up. Um, when we allow ourselves to name our emotion, it improves the psychological flexibility and reduces chronic stress. Okay, let's see here. Next slide. Honoring the sacred work, right? Caregiving is sacred, even when it hurts. Okay. So I want to remind you of something that can get lost in the shuffle of appointments and getting all the medications together and all the doctors or all the endless to-dos that you have to do, right? You're not just keeping someone alive, you are witnessing their life, right? You're tending to a soul and you're holding presence in this in-between space, right? And that is sacred. And I'm not speaking from like a religious or dogmatic perspective. I'm speaking just from a human's perspective, right? Even when it's heavy and even when your job is thankless, even when you feel like you're barely holding it together, it's still sacred, right? And being angry or resentful or bitter, it doesn't erase the love that you have for that person. And if you need space, it doesn't make you a less devoted caregiver, right? Boundaries aren't betrayal. That's part of the sacred work, right? That's part of the blessing. So you are allowed to be whole, not perfect, not silent, right? Not selfless, but a whole person. And that includes honoring the pleasant things and the not so pleasant things, right? That's where we find wholeness, not by keeping certain parts of us in the shadows, but bringing all of it into the light and loving all of it anyway, right? So the most powerful caregiving does not come from being a martyr and from sacrificing yourself in every capacity. It comes from honesty. It comes from being present with yourself and knowing what's yours to carry, and more importantly, what's not yours to carry, right? And so honoring all of that, that's where the reverence comes in, right? So the concept of meaning making in caregiving improves resilience. It reduces depressive symptoms and strengthens emotional bonds. And this is from a 2000 study by Folkman and Greer. And so when we say meaning making, that's when we say, like, if we consider caregiving as sacred, if we find meaning in the work we're doing, if we can find reverence in this space, it actually improves your resilience and actually reduces your risk of depression. And it strengthens the emotional bond that you have with the person you're taking care of. And I would say to other relationships, other interpersonal relationships you have. And one of the most predictive factors in reducing your burnout is self-compassion. More so than time off, more so than any external resource, it's that self-compassion, right? I'm allowed to feel this way. It's okay that I feel this way. I'm going to honor myself in this space, okay? And I'm going to be proactive in meeting a need that my emotions are trying to bring to my attention, okay? Ooh. So final reflections and key takeaways. Especially in the hard days, I want you to remember these things, that your difficult emotions are not flaws. They are sacred messengers, right? They're telling you something important. Your resentment is not a shameful secret. It is a signpost saying, turn back, right? Cliff ahead, right? And your boundaries are not betrayals, they're bridges back to yourself, back to your truth, back to your identity, right? Even if that's changed over time, okay? And you don't have to wait until you're absolutely falling apart to rest, okay? You don't have to wait until you hit a wall before you finally stop, okay? You can see the wall coming and slow your pace, right? Or course correct, change course, right? And you don't have to justify your needs to people who expect you to stay quiet about them, right? Some people don't want to hear you complain, and that's fine. Some people don't want to hear that you're stressed, and that's fine. But you don't have to justify why you feel the way you do. Okay. You just feel the way you do, and that's okay. So, again, I've said it a million times, and I'll say it a million times more. Taking care of yourself isn't selfish. Caring for you is caring for your loved one, right? All right. So the more whole you are, that means the more you accept all the facets of you, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the more present you can be with yourself and with your loved one. Okay, so it's a win-win. It's hard, but it's a win-win. And I would say it's probably necessary. All right. So that's my info for today. And I will stop the recording.